So now I'd like to welcome our second speaker up, PRODROMOS TSIAVOS from Postscriptum. He will be back.
Compatibility problems, but we're just trying to find a VGA out. All right. Sure, I have this one as well. All right. Okay. Thanks for your patience. What I will try to do today, first of all, to say hi, I'm PRODROMOS. I work for Postscriptum for today's presentation, at least. And what I will try to talk about is how we actually create value using hybrid licensing models. And I understand that this is a question that even the title may seem quite obscure. What does it mean to have hybrid licensing models, and how exactly do we create value? And what I will try to do is actually to provide you an overview of how we do that in 5 steps. So first of all, I'll try to speak about value and understand how we may perceive value in the context of what we're trying to do in this project. Then to explain how the policies have changed as to how policymakers and cultural institutions perceive the production of value. So how we moved gradually from a regime of exclusion, which is the traditional copyright regime or the traditional copyright management regime, to regimes of inclusion, which are the open licensing schemes. And then I go to something which is called the data value chain, which is a quite crucial concept for the European Commission, because this is where we should be placing ourselves, and this is the thing we should always ask ourselves: how do we actually produce value and how we are positioned within the data value chain? Then I'll talk about the licensing and see specific licensing models, and finally I'll give you a postscriptum of the basic points I will cover. So let's start with the first thing, and which is understanding the value in an open environment. This work is work that is done by Postscriptum, and the reason why I'm referring to Postscriptum is because it's a small and medium enterprise. Actually, it's a small enterprise in Greece, which actually tries to produce profits, have profits, but at the same time tries to promote openness. So it tries to manage cultural assets for the digital era, and by doing that, it's pretty much what the Commission has in mind when it introduces variables regulations like the Public Sector Information Regulations Directive, the open data and open content policies. They try to allow companies like Postscriptum to produce more value for cultural institutions, to hire more people, and basically make sure that both people have access to cultural content, but money is made. So we come to the question of value and what value means. And value is not necessarily always the same, tautolymous with monetization. And monetization is not always the same as making money out of the market. So a cultural institution may need to make money, but they get the money possibly through subsidies or grants. they do not necessarily sell. Actually, most of the cultural institutions fail to sell because there is a market failure as to how you could provide access to such content. People don't want to buy it, basically. So while value is not just about money, money is important. So we need to figure out how, while we are in an open environment, we still have to produce some kind of monetary flow. And if we want to conceptualize this, we have to think of the metaphor of water. And I use that as a metaphor because it helps us understand that open licensing is not that different from traditional licensing, at least to certain respects. So try to think of content as water. So we need water for a number of reasons. And sometimes water itself is enough. You can drink it or consume it. So these are the cases where you don't want to produce anything else other than making sure that water somehow is provided. Sometimes you want to produce energy, in other words, money, or some form of value. And for that reason, you need restrictions. And restrictions operate like the mill in the water mill. So the way licenses work, permissions work, is basically like a form of a mill that takes the content and produces energy, value. So basically what we want to see here is how are we going to regulate this flow in the most effective and efficient way? How are we going to control the flow of content through the flow of rights so as to produce value? And this all is being done through licensing. So licensing, and we may deconstruct a license. A license basically says three things. Things you can do, things you cannot do, and things you must do. And this is very relevant, and for the technical people in the audience, if you see the RDF expressions of the licenses, basically they operate on these three premises. And that's the reason, and I'll repeat that many times, that's the reason why we need to have very good metadata representation of the licensing schemes and ideally semantic representation of the licensing schemes. So we know these three things, because if we know these three things, then we can maximize the flows of value with a minimal transaction cost, with a minimal friction, and we can produce value. And when the license don't work, the flow stops. And that's what happens. So the problem that we have with traditional copyright schemes is that we cannot really have something that flows, and that's why value is not produced. And since we're in Venice, money is important, and flows are important. Almost as important as martini.
No martini? No party.
So no flows, no party. We need to somehow make sure that the flows happen, and we need to make sure that the value is produced. So let's go to the second point, and let's see how this is expressed in policies. So we have the value policies. We have the traditional value policies that try to produce incentives. In the sense you want to actually produce the water, and the water doesn't exist. So you have regimes of exclusion that give an incentive to the producer to actually produce such content so that the water flows. And that's how a traditional scheme works. Now, what happens when the content is produced anyhow, when the water is there anyhow, then you need to reduce frictions. Therefore, you don't need a scheme like copyright, which is exclusion, or you don't need a traditional copyright scheme, which works through exclusion, but you need a regime which actually increases access. And that's why we have open licenses, and that's why we have the public sector information policies and a series of other open data policies. And this is not just an EU phenomenon. We have the OECD papers on the public sector information and open data, on knowledge capital, the G8, PSI, and open data commitments, the open government partnership commitments, the World Bank policies on open data. All these because the knowledge-based capital, whatever is making this economy work, is not just IPR. IPR is one of them. Branding is based on IPR, but a lot of it, as we go from the top IPR to the low, which is networks, has to do with relationships. Because what we have is a transition. So we have a transition from goods to relations. So monetization don't necessarily happen by selling goods, but monetization happens by selling relations. Let's go to our third point, which is the data value chain. In order to understand that, we need to see how this flow happens through a value chain from the production of data to its actual consumption. And I'm not going to go in detail, the slides anyway are going to be available, but what I want to focus here is that you need a series of things that actually ensure that you can produce the relevant content and you can actually have also the personnel that is able to produce value out of this. And if we think how a data value chain looks, and this comes from the EC paper on the data value chain, you see that we have the data generation down there, or content generation, and you have a series of services that come up to the top, which are based on this data generation. They're based on this content generation. And what happens is you need to ask, where am I as a cultural institution there? And what is interesting is that the public institutions normally are at the bottom of data generation or data validation, whereas the companies tend to be at the top. And the problem we have is that there is a lot of value being produced, but it's not necessarily that the value that is being produced at the top of the value chain can actually go to the bottom of the value chain. So we have a discrepancy here. It could be that we actually produce digital content, we digitize, but it's not necessarily that we have a value flow back to the cultural institution. And that's quite crucial if we want to have a sustainable model. And this is what we should be thinking as well in the context of creating our spaces and creating our models. So the instruments to do that is licensing. So licensing could help us do several things. And if we go back to licenses, in other words, three things, don't forget licenses are a holder for three things: permissions, restrictions, and duties, things you cannot do, and you must do. Then we see that the value that is being produced may be different from the licensor, which is the entity that provides the content, let's say a museum, and the licensee, which is the entity that consumes the content, which could be an intermediary, like an apps developer, or an end user. So the value is not necessarily the same for the two entities. It could be that the museum gains value by increasing the visibility of its collection and the visitors to its physical collection, and the licensee gains value by selling the application. So there are different forms of value that are for the different stakeholders within an ecology. And value may be produced as a result either of the use itself. So for instance, by allowing people to use my metadata, I produce value. I don't want to add any restrictions, and that's one of the reasons why Europeana ended up with CC0. This is not entirely correct because there are certain types of metadata that look like content. But I'll leave that aside for the time being and assume that the metadata is just for identifying content. So by allowing the licensing of metadata for free, you have value being produced just by using them. The second case is when value is produced from conditions of use. For instance, I provide a picture under a Creative Commons attribution license. I tell to people they can do whatever they want as long as they attribute back to me. So the value here comes from the condition, as long as they attribute back to me. The third case is that the actual value is produced out of lifting a condition. For instance, I allow you to use this picture, but I don't want you to use it commercially. But then you want to create sneakers, you're Converse, and you want to have a Vermeer painting. For that reason, you have to pay me. So I lift the condition of non-commercial use and I produce value. So these are the three, I'm schematizing here, but these are the three core ways of producing value through licensing schemes. Now, correspondingly, you have costs, and these costs in any kind of copyright transaction are of three kinds, as we described them yesterday as well. We have costs of finding the material, and these are costs both for the person that wants to use it, because if they don't find it, they cannot use it, but it's a cost for the entity that has the content. If they don't find my content, how can I produce any value out of this? The second thing is negotiation. Let's say that you found the content, you need to make sure you have an agreement. And that costs. It costs to lawyers, time, for both sides. And then you have the actual license grant, where I give you the license and I get the fee. And the cost there is for the user, but it's not for the content provider. Creative Commons licenses, all Creative Commons licenses, actually eradicate the first two costs, sets and negotiation, and the grant cost, but as we will see later, and that's why we're talking about hybrid licensing forms, they are not enough. They have to be complemented by a secondary agreement, and I'll show you what I mean. The Creative Commons licenses, as you probably know, they comprise of three elements. A commons deed, which is a description which can be read by someone who's not a lawyer, a legal code, which ensures that the license can be placed within a certain jurisdiction and it is compatible with multiple jurisdictions, and finally metadata, which simply say that this license this item is licensed under license X, nothing else. And I think here we have a major handicap. And that's the reason why we need to actually not just say that this item is licensed under this particular license, but we need gradually to have machine-readable licenses. We need our machines to be able to understand the content of the licenses. And that's the work that the Open Data Rights Expression Languages, the ODRL does, or the CCRL does. So there is a lot of interesting work as to how you represent the conditions of the licenses in machine-readable form, so the machine can do the negotiation for you as well. So you can tell to the machine what do you want, and the machine can choose a license for you. Now try to remember, when we talk about licenses, it's not really clear what we mean. What do you license? We license normally metadata and data, and we need different things from the two things. In metadata, we can have minimum possible restriction because the value does not come necessarily from selling the metadata. The value comes from either the digital object, the digital surrogates, or the physical collection. That's why in metadata we go for very liberal licenses. Now, things get tricky when the metadata become like content, as is the case with cultural heritage material that you find in archaeological excavations, as it is the case with curated content where you have the curator's notes. But in most cases, when metadata simply is a gateway to the data, we go for the most liberal license because we're not going to make money out of the metadata. Second thing is who gains value. Is it the licensor or the licensee? You need to understand that from each transaction there has to be some kind of value for both sides. Otherwise, there is no point of having the transaction. So you want to open up your content. How you open up the content needs to be accompanied by some sort of value proposition for the two parties. And finally, who bears the costs? And that's a crucial question for the cultural institutions. I pay lots of money to digitize my content, which I get through a subsidy or through my budget, and then I give it out for free. Good. And then I have an app developer who produces something out of this content. That's good as well. How am I going to continue digitizing, or how am I going to continue to actually have the ability to actually have my collection being restored, or how I'm going to preserve my collection. So I need to find a money flow for my costs if there is to be some value. And the value has to be somehow identifiable. For instance, if I increase the visibility of my museum and my collection, and I increase the people coming to the physical connection, is this expressed in some kind of monetary flow? Does it mean that I get more money from the state? Does it mean that I get a grant? Does it mean that I sell something? I have to ask these questions, and I have to be able to provide an answer. So who bears the cost and who gains the value are two crucial questions. So I'll go now through 5 points, which are 5 points, 5 licenses, which we need to understand how they operate. I start with the 0 conditions, which we find in Creative Commons 0, by the way, which in most European jurisdictions is construed as a license that licenses all economic rights. In the UK, it may be construed as a waiver, but in lots of other jurisdictions is construed as a license. So practically it means allow people to do whatever they want without any conditions, to the extent that the law doesn't prohibit me from doing so. The value here equals to use. So whatever I license under CC0, I, as an institution, as a licensor, I produce my value just by allowing people to use it. For instance, when I actually license my metadata, there is a disposition from the value of the item to the value of something else. I allow people to use my metadata, but what I want people actually is to find my content, my data, to find the physical item and to find the place where this thing takes place. So that's the reason I don't actually make money out of metadata. And here, the focus should be most probably on the meta thing, the thing that is able to identify your content. So CC0 is primarily used when you want to actually increase visibility of collections, and it's used for the meta content, not for your actual content. Attribution. Attribution is a license element, so it's one of the 4 elements that we find in all Creative Commons licenses. Now, I need your attention here because this is probably the most important thing in all Creative Commons licenses and in our projects. All open licenses have attribution as a requirement. Here, the value is produced for the content producer out from the content disseminator actually, out of the condition of attribution. So the condition of attribution is what produces the value, not the use of the material. The use of the material is good, but it's the condition. And why this is relevant? Because in the attribution, if you read the Creative Commons licenses 4.0, they ask you to tell 3 things. who is the entity that makes the content available? Who is the creator of the content? And what's the item? So if you attribute correctly, and again we go back to the metadata issue, so if you have correct metadata about the attribution, and you can have them because Creative Commons has a wizard for that, and we should work on this issue on the rights labeling part of this project, then your audience is able to find either the digital surrogates, or the artist, or the institution. If you don't attribute right, then you kill your value here. So you need to understand how you're going to attract your audience to your primary collection or item. So you need information about the institution. You need information about the item, which means both the place where the item is placed, but it also may mean a price. So for instance, let's take the British Museum. Let's assume the British Museum makes an image available for free. It tells you can find it in gallery number 5, and you can get a picture of that, a reproduction, a limited reproduction for £100 in the shop, and you can order it online. So immediately I have a value chain. Immediately I have a way of producing value for the particular item, and it happens through attribution, because I'm able to link that. And then it may, if you bring people as audience, then you can make money out of membership, out of tickets for a particular exhibition, admission, or you can allow people to find similar artifacts. So if I know this is a medieval plate, or if I know it's a Greek vase, I can actually link it to other Greek vases and potentially also lead my audiences back to my collection. The non-derivatives element, this is interesting because the value comes both from the condition, which is don't make derivatives, and from lifting the condition. Someone pays me to actually make the derivatives. So here the condition, the value that comes from the condition of not allowing derivatives mainly has to do with the integrity of the work. So I don't want people to make derivatives because I think otherwise the material is disturbed. And when I lift the restriction, I can allow people to actually have commercial uses of the derivatives. A very classic example, I'm returning to this one, is producing t-shirts, sneakers, all this merchandise are derivative works. So this one links to the non-commercial elements that we'll see later, but it means actually that by lifting the condition, you are able to actually monetize. And again here, this is something which is quite interesting. You may lift the condition individually for every user, so I allow only Nike to make t-shirts, or generic, so I allow everyone to make t-shirts. Apparently, Nike is going to pay 10 euros if it's just for it, and 1,000 euros if it is for everyone, because it's the size of the market which is the cost of lifting the condition for everyone. So that's also a very important thing. When you lift the condition in the ancillary license, in the second license, you can choose to lift it for a single individual or for everyone. Share alike or copyleft. It means basically that I allow people to actually make changes, derivatives to my work, but whatever changes they make, they have to actually license them again further under the same terms and conditions. The value comes both from the condition and the lifting of the condition. From the condition, first of all, it's a viral thing. It means that any derivative works are going to be licensed under the same license. So I increase the commons. The second thing is that I reduce the cost of co-production. So if I wanted to make sneakers again, or I want to make t-shirts, I would have to pay someone. Now they do it for free. It creates more associations, so I deeper my audience. And de facto is non-commercial because people cannot really actually make money through exclusion. So whenever I have a copyleft license, people are not inclined to make money out of this. For instance, if I give a text with a share-alike license, a publisher is not very inclined to make a commercial publication because they will have to make it out available for free under the same terms and conditions. So here, in order to be able to make, and this comes from, the value comes from the actual condition of share-alike. In order to really monetize that, or in order to really produce value, I need to know the provenance. If there have been 10 transformations, I really need to know which these transformations have been, who has made this transformation, and link them. And I go back to the metadata issue. That's why you need to have provision for someone to be able to track the provisions, even with a voluntary scheme. And I can explain to you how we can do that legally in the questions. Here, if you want to lift the restrictions, mainly you're going to lift it for a commercial player, the publisher who said. So here you have two, again I repeat, two ways to monetize. One is you reduce costs from co-production and you deepen your audience. And the second thing is that you actually lift it for commercial, for a fee. And here again, you can lift it for a specific individual or you can lift it for everyone. We have again the same thing we said before. The non-commercial element. People use it the whole time. The value really comes mostly from lifting the permission. lifting the restriction, so from the permission. So someone wants to use it commercially, they pay you money, they use it commercially. Now, we have a lot of definitional issues with non-commercial, and that's why we are inclined not to use it much. If we are to use it, we have to explain what we mean by non-commercial. Are we referring to the use, to the user? Is it going to cover the cost? Is it going to cover the profit? We need to be sure what we mean by that. And I often say that this has a totemic use. Quite a few of the cultural institutions use it because it sounds nice. They don't understand why, but it sounds nice not to allow people to commercially use it. And here again, you can lift a restriction for a specific user or for everyone. Just before I finish, what I just said is just about the Creative Commons licenses, but these are not the only licenses in the town, in the city. It's not only the only talk in the town. We have other licenses, especially in the text and data mining context. We have the Clarin licenses, the MetaShare licenses. We also have what we call laundry symbols, and that's an interesting thing. People try to group legal functionality into greater chunks than license elements, so they want to have all things that relate to derivative works. So they gather the share alike and the non-derivative. They could add things that have to do with the non-commercial. So there are other variations of licenses, and also a final point in this slide, just don't confuse the clearing side of things from the licensing side of things. And I'm referring to the also to the Europeana rights labeling campaign. Rights labeling is a bit dismissive, a bit confusing. What we mean when you know your rights, it means you know who owns the thing. When we talk about the license, it means you know how you actually condition the use. These are two different things. Okay? I hope this is clear. And I go to my conclusions, which is my postscriptum. What we see and what we have seen the past 10 years is an increase of policies of inclusion instead of exclusion. That's why we have regimes like the Public Sector Information Directive. That's why we have the open data policies. Nevertheless, regimes of exclusions like copyright can be still used, and this happens mainly through open licenses. Open licenses are not straightforward. Open licenses are tools, but these tools have to be used in order to generate value in the ways we described before, so that I can tell where I am in the value chain, whether I'm a licensor and I know where the license, where is produced, or what is the value that is produced, and whether I am the licensee. Will I make money out of this? And the most important question that we should ask for all stakeholders is whether I use a license or an open license or the all rights reserved licenses, what's in it for me? And that's not an easy question. Thank you very much.